This morning, I want to talk to you guys about the prominence of identitarianism within digital media. This is something that we don't really see at big news organizations like CBS and NBC, but it is becoming more prevalent within the New York Times, especially with the incident with Sarah Jung. Now, the first thing I want to do is tell you what identitarian means, because some people reject the term and some people embrace it. But according to the Oxford Dictionary, identitarian is relating to or supporting the political interest of a particular racial, ethnic, or national group, typically one composed of Europeans or white people. Now, the reason I believe they use typically one composed of Europeans and white people because the identitarian movement embraces this. And these are people like Generation Identity and Identity Europa. They embrace their identity as their political talking point, essentially. That's what they base their politics on. However, it does not have to be that. Simply, those are the ones who use the term most commonly. But at its core, relating to the political interests of a particular racial, ethnic, or national group, or supporting, could fit people who also oppose the alt-right and Generation Identity and things like that. But I want to pull up to expand the definition a little bit more, and to be fair to those who have varying degrees of those who disagree on the definition of racist. We're going to show the sociological and psychological definition of identitarianism. So in psychology, it is the set of ideas arising from an ontology of identity. And in sociology, it's politics based on social identity. And I think this is the most apt definition in the sociological one, because it's actually very simple, okay? Now, I also want to look at the definition of racism, which I've gone over before, and it's a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races. This is the definition of racist, and this is from the Oxford Dictionary. Now, racism can be something different, but not racist, okay? People say that racism is either, positive or negative discrimination based on race, or it's prejudice plus power, which is a 1970s academic definition. But I'm not looking at the word racism, which is an ism, a belief structure, but racist. And that is a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races. It's actually very simple. So now I'm going to go through this thread, and I'm going to talk about Nick Monroe, and he went through BuzzFeed, found a bunch of staff members who were anti-white, and I want to talk about my sentiment. I did this tweet thread, so I decided to make a video about it for, a morning video. But I said, I find it disconcerting that so many of the people working in digital media are identitarians. White identitarians were actually praising the New York Times handling of Sarah Jung because, positive or negative, their actions encourage more identitarianism. And to elaborate on that, people on 4chan and other boards who are white ethno-nationalists or white identitarians, people who want a racial consciousness among whites, were actually praising the New York Times. There was one statement where someone said, if only the New York Times, if only we had 1,000 more Sarah Jungs, white people would achieve racial consciousness. And this is what they want. For me, I'm much more of an American. Like, we're all Americans, and let's uphold certain principles and certain values. So it's alarming to me that the people who are espousing this anti-white message and this narrative, who might think it's funny or an inside joke, that's actually how Vox described it, as kind of an inside joke, that they're actually encouraging white identitarians. But I think there's a reason for it. So let's continue. I said, I have to wonder then if it's conscious. Leftist identitarians know their actions will fuel the alt-right and encourage more of the same. They can then use white identitarianism to further push their own. So I feel like there's a group of more follower type people within these big media companies. It's mostly like Vox and BuzzFeed and Huffington Post. And I think some of them just follow suit because they want to virtue signal to their tribe that they're like them too. They want to be accepted. However, there are probably a lot of people that know full well when they post things, like, actually, we'll use the example of Sarah Jung. She said she was posting these things to counter-troll people who were trolling her, which isn't necessarily true because many of her tweets were just straight tweets to nobody, like to everybody. But if we go by her general explanation, she's essentially saying that when white identitarians started tweeting things about white identity, she countered by attacking their identity. And all that can serve to do is encourage people who are not identitarian to protect themselves based on their race. So if you go to somebody who's uninitiated, not very active in politics, and tell them you're going to take something from them or do something to them, or there is something wrong with them simply because of the color of their skin, you are encouraging them to rally with other people who have similar characteristics to them in order to protect themselves. It's very simple, in which I would have to assume that many of these people on the left know this. So I said, I see all of the anti-white tweets coming from these media people that are being highlighted by Nick Monroe. Surely they know that this kind of sentiment, joking or otherwise, encourages white identitarianism. Journalists, real ones, have actually talked about this too. It's called reciprocal extremism, and Majid Nawaz talks about it. That when the left comes out and says white people, white privilege, white cis heteronormativity, and attacks people based on characteristics they can't change, that is an identitarian attack. It is politics based on social identity. And they're attacking people who have nothing to do with this. So the natural response then is for some of these people who might feel threatened to rally around and create and expand their group. They're going to try to recruit for it now. This is everything they're doing, whether it's on purpose or not, is creating more of the same. Some people have told me that the identitarianism, regardless of the left or the right, is at its core the same thing, just different factions of identitarians who are at odds with each other. And so the left needs to encourage identitarianism because they are identitarians. I know I'm kind of beating that word to death. But I started wondering about this the other day, why they challenge the definition of the word racist. It's so they can call one group racist and protect themselves from being racist. Simply put, they can't challenge the right-wing identitarians on their core arguments because they themselves hold the exact same views, politics based on their social identity. So what they have to do is say, well, they're racist, but we're not, even though we do the same thing. And that's, in my opinion, kind of the point. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people who don't understand that and just follow along because it's part of the trend or whatever group they're in, and they don't want to be ostracized from their tribe. But certainly the leaders are aware of this. I said, but then, of course, they can point to it and go, see, look at these Nazis. And right. Thus fueling more leftist identitarianism. Because when you attack one group, don't be surprised when that group rallies to protect themselves. But they want that, because then they can point to that and claim the alt-right is on the rise. And that's something they've repeatedly been doing. They act like, there are people who are tweeting the Nazis have returned. When in reality, it's the alt-right is a relatively small fringe group. There's not very many of them. According to most hate watch type groups, there's probably only around 10,000 or so white supremacists in the entire United States, out of 325 million people or so. Of working class adults, I think it's like 240 million. So that is a ridiculously tiny minority of this country who are actually white supremacist. But when we look at leftist identitarianism, it's actually mainstream. It's acceptable. BuzzFeed is staffed, and let's jump over to Nick Monroe's tweets. We can see that he's got a huge list of various BuzzFeed staff who are identitarian, I'm sure this is not surprising to so many people to see. This is BuzzFeed. All right, so I worked for Vice. I would say this was not that prevalent at Vice. Vice really didn't, but it was also 2013, so it wasn't becoming as prevalent. But when I worked at Fusion was probably exclusively identitarian. So when it comes to the digital media they were doing, so that the website, the editor-in-chief was an identitarian. Alexis Madrigal had a Twitter banner on his Twitter account. He works for The Atlantic now, that said "Down with Whiteness," right? This is literal identitarianism. It's very worrying to me because I feel like these people who are making these attacks or encouraging this behavior are leading us to a future that can only result in balkanization. They did this at Occupy Wall Street. They told people to go into various groups based on their identity. There was the Spokes Council, and they said, so this is the Colored Caucus, this is the Asian Caucus, this is Latino Caucus, this is the Women's Caucus. And these caucuses were allowed to elect a representative to vote on how money was spent simply based on their race, their gender, identity, etc. I feel like this kind of behavior has become pervasive now within media. And these media companies are extremely influential. So I want to highlight this article from The Atlantic in just a second. But I said, it's so weird to see the mugshots of Antifa being almost entirely white. To see white journalists claim to be anti-racist but encourage identitarianism. They hide behind an obscure 1970s definition of racism to justify their hate. Identitarianism is politics based on social identity. And that's not entirely racist because it encompasses more things. It can encompass LGBTQ, trans, etc. But within identitarianism is policy that would discriminate or be prejudicial against someone based on their race. And prejudicial doesn't have to be negative, it can be positive. If you are going to afford someone something or deprive someone of something because of their race, you are racist, according to the Oxford definition. When we get into the argument about prejudice plus power, it gets a bit more complicated and confusing because you can't really quantify power, and the argument is actually very, very challenging. So that's why I typically just try to go by the standard definition of prejudice based on race. We can call it racial prejudice if it's more satisfactory to a lot of people. But we can say that there are a lot of people who are claiming to oppose these kinds of behaviors, but actually encourage racial prejudice. They encourage bigotry. They call other people hateful bigots. But then, as we saw from Nick Monroe, there's a huge list of BuzzFeed staff who are absolutely hateful bigots themselves. It's almost like when we saw Antifa in Berkeley carrying shields that said no hate, and were literally beating people with it. I'm not kidding. It's hilarious. I call that it's like a fire truck on fire, right? The epitome of irony. So I tweeted, I sat in my yard with a couple people of varying race and talked about this. And this is true. I was in my yard of people of varying races, and their specific races is irrelevant. Suffice it to say, many non-white people. And we were just confused as to why so many people want to play up racism. The people claiming to oppose racism are the ones who are actively encouraging it the most. As I mentioned, the alt-right's tiny. But the alt-left, and what I mean by alt-left is, alt connoting identitarianism. So that's how I kind of use it. The alt-left at BuzzFeed, at the Verge, at Vox, at Huffington Post, they're actively encouraging racial prejudice. So it's almost like they're hiding behind it, but they truly are. And some of them, as I mentioned, probably don't know. I'm told by identitarians on both sides, alt-left and alt-right, that whatever I am is wrong. I'm too white for the alt-left, and I'm not white at all for the alt-right. And that's true. And hence, you can probably see why I'm not very much into identity politics. Because you would think that as, a mixed-race person, the smallest minority, I believe it's the smallest minority in the country, we can get into arguments technically, then you would think that I would be an oppressed minority supported by the left. But I disagree with their dogmatic tactics. I disagree with their encouragement of race-based policy and identitarianism. Thus, I am a problem for them, and they will just call me white and say, I don't understand because I'm white. Whereas the alt-right wants a white ethno-state, and I'm a, race mixer or whatever. So that's not appropriate for what many of them want to do. Though admittedly, there are many people on the alt-right who are more about the culture they view of the white ethnic culture, and thus to them they're like, it's okay. But for me, it's identitarianism ultimately is just not good. And I explain this is why I call it alt-left, because alt connotes identitarianism, and with them having so much sway in media, I'm seriously concerned. The alt-left has massive influence, hundreds of millions every day in many countries pushing identitarianism. And so now I want to go to this article from the Atlantic. And they called it The Utility of White Bashing. It's a rhetoric that serves a purpose, which is why it's not likely to disappear. It's by Rehan Salam. I'm not familiar with Rehan's work, but this is an actually really interesting article. And I want to focus specifically on this one paragraph. To state the obvious, Zhang is hardly alone in colorfully expressing anti-white sentiment. And it is this broader phenomenon I find most interesting. Honestly, I've been around this sort of talk, most of it at least half-joking, for most of my life. Years ago, I even affectionately parodied it. The people I've heard archly denounce whites have for the most part been upwardly mobile people who've proven pretty adept at navigating elite, predominantly white spaces. A lot of them have been whites who pride themselves on their diverse social circles and their enlightened views, and who indulge in their own half-ironic white bashing to underscore that it is their achieved identity as intelligent, worldly people that counts most, not their ascribed identity as being of recognizably European descent. So they go on to say that, upper white might not be the right way to explain it. But when you look at some of these people highlighted by Nick Monroe, you can clearly see that while some of them are not white, which makes them just generally racist by Oxford standards, there are a lot of white people who are at BuzzFeed who make a lot of these statements that are anti-white. And to me, this is, for one, it's a virtue signal. They want to make sure their tribe knows that they don't like white people. And even if they don't really mean it, or they're specifically referring to an idea of whiteness, it's just about being a part of the tribe and fitting in and not being ostracized. But something else that I saw with Occupy Wall Street, I think a lot of this behavior is actually a hedge. They're trying to protect themselves in the event of actual racial conflict. If it comes to the point where identitarianism is on the rise, and it is, and we see more segregation based on race, they want to make sure that when people come for them, they say, hey, don't you remember? I'm the person who doesn't like white people, and they'll be protected. So obviously, BuzzFeed has a large staff, and it's become a culture. But you know what? I'm gonna deviate a little bit there because I want to wrap up kind of soon. I don't want to go on too long. But I just want to point out that, for one, I'm not a fan of identitarianism, and the alt-right is really small, and they don't have much power at all. They were trying to gain power for a while, and they've been kind of pushed out, and they're unsuccessful. Why? Because white identitarianism is significantly less appealing than this other non-white identitarianism. There's an actual concern over white supremacy and Nazism and these kinds of behaviors that are heavily, that are historically just awful, evil, demonized, etc. So you're going to have a hard time getting anyone to want to have anything to do with that. But on the other extreme end of authoritarianism, we have communism, and we have a lot of people who are identitarians and identity extremists, to say the least. What we're seeing here with all of these different digital media companies, which is, look, BuzzFeed's huge, Huffington Post, The Daily Beast, Newsweek, The Verge, these digital websites, these sites are entrenched with identitarians. And when you realize that, I think this is a bigger threat for one reason. For one thing, the alt-right can't exist without the constant attacks, insults, and degradation coming from these people. Because as the alt-right was praising the New York Times for their handling of Sarah Jung, as I mentioned in that tweet, because it's the attacks on white people encourage white people to rally together. So they need that, but that's why their group is small, because most people don't care. But when these people, the left identitarians, are so influential in all these media companies, getting millions of views, constantly writing about white people, they're going to encourage, for one, non-white people are going to see these things and think it's okay and join in, and that's going to further increase support for white identitarians. It's also just going to generally, whether or not anyone joins in, you're going to have average people accepting this, and they're going to start advocating for politics based on their race. Even Don Lemon on CNN said that he wanted to be viewed as a black man. He doesn't want a colorblind society. And for me, I have to wonder if, personally, I really don't think that's a good thing. I understand the idea of colorblind, is where you don't see race and you allow people to be whatever they are, is not absolute. There's nuance in the argument. But if we reduce everyone to their race, we're taking away individual rights. And what's scary to me is that everything we're seeing from all of these tweets, and there are just so many, it goes on and on and on, and these articles that are anti-white go on and on and on. To me, what this says is that identitarianism is taking over. If media companies are finding this behavior acceptable, if the New York Times would excuse Sarah Jung, who is an open and admitted identitarian, then we are headed for a future that is nothing but racist. And the left doesn't care. And what bothers me is they claim to oppose racism. They claim to oppose let's even use a sociological definition. Institutional power plus racial prejudice. Sure. So when a Harvard-educated lawyer, Sarah Jung, starts attacking people, you have to realize that there are a lot of poor white people. She's wielding institutional power at a media company. The New York Times is now employing her. She is a Harvard-educated Asian attacking a race. And if we go by institutional power, we can see that Asians are overrepresented in universities and in high-paying jobs and things that affect, to me, that would be institutional power, right? But the left doesn't, they won't be critical of themselves. They'll claim that's the definition so that they can excuse their own racist behavior while pointing out the racist, the other identitarians they don't like. But they, no matter what definition you use, they are racist. And what's worrying, the reason I want to talk about this, and I'm going to end it because I'm going on 20 minutes, is that this can only lead in one direction. That the more they talk, the more they condemn people for being white, the more they condemn people based on their gender, their race, their identity, the more they embrace identitarianism, the worse it's going to get. It really will be just a bad society where you are going to be punished because you look a certain way. And that's not something at least it's not something I want to be a part of. It's not a way that I want to live. I have had people attack me from both sides, and it's probably why I don't like identitarianism at all. But you know what? I think there's a million more things that I could talk about in regards to the anti-white rhetoric and the identitarianism. I suppose one more thing that I could talk about before going is one of the things I've noticed, as they mentioned in this article, is that it's from The Atlantic, the upwardly mobile white people who are attacking the lower class, if you are a white person who lived in a really nice suburb, who had a middle class family and went to college, yes, it's true, you've probably never experienced this kind of extreme strife. And so another thing that happens is they view themselves as privileged and they say, oh, wow, when I hear these stories in the news about these poor minorities being attacked and things of that effect, I never experienced that, therefore all white people never experienced that. But that's just not true, because most white people don't live in these nice suburbs and these wealthier kinds of places, though there are a disproportionate amount of who do. Essentially, you have a lot of poor white people who don't understand why they're being attacked. They work crummy jobs in the middle of nowhere, probably at McDonald's, Subway, or Walmart, and they're being attacked, being told they have privilege, and they don't understand why. And all that can do, I'll say this, last thing. If you want to encourage people to understand the ideas of privilege, you don't attack them for it. You don't insult them. You don't repeatedly post things about how you want white people dead. You don't post things about, how you hate white people and how you hate them so much, and I hate white people. They're so, having a I hate white people week, ban white men, cancel white people. You don't post you love being cruel to them, because all that's going to do is scare people and push them towards identitarianism. And that, I'm really worried that we're headed towards a balkanized future, right? Where all the different races are put in different areas, because that's essentially what everyone's arguing. Sargon of Akkad made a point a long time ago where he said that these people should absolutely team up with the alt-right because they agree. The white ethno-nationalists want their own space for white people, and these people don't like white people and have actually said, kill a straight white man on your way to work tomorrow. Whether or not that's a joke, people are going to see that and not like it. So if these people who hated white people so much actually worked with the alt-right, they could segregate themselves. Personally, I find that terrifying. And that's one of the reasons why I'm getting away from big cities, not to be paranoid or anything, but just I want to stay away from this kind of extreme political narrative, and just maybe that something happens when you get older. But anyway, I've been prattling on for a long time now. I've got a lot more to talk about in this regard, but I'm going to end it here. And I will have a video up at 4 p.m., so stick around. Thanks for watching. You can follow me on Twitter at Timcast. I'll see you all next time.